When it comes to local governments, most large countries are almost like an administrative fractal of sorts. The further you zoom in, the more and more smaller subdivisions and subdivisions of subdivisions you start to find. In these terms, the United States is absolutely no different, and is arguably a perfect example of this. The US has states, counties, and all other sorts of weird district anomalies. You could even argue that the United States itself is a subdivision of America. Well, if we were speaking Spanish or Portuguese here, but I think you get the point. Now, most countries around the world also behave like this. In fact, Germany behaves in more or less the same way as America does. But I'm gonna go with America for this video because it's just easier for me to explain since I'm from there, and America's a big country, which will make this video ever so fun. American subdivisions are a kind of layer cake, in that there is always a government of higher power that outranks the smaller local governments, at least until you reach the federal government, unless you count NATO, the United Nations, and the United Federation of Planets, but most people don't, so we'll stick with the nation for now. The United States of America is a large nation which spans much of North America and Oceania, and is governed from the national capital, Washington, D.C., and is led largely by a president who reports to the National Congress, made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives. The United States is divided into 50 states in an arrangement that's actually kind of more like 13 states that combine into one country and tacked on 37 others. This is because the states weren't all carved up from the US itself, well, at least not the first few. And in reflection of this, they effectively share the sovereignty with the nation as a whole, which basically means that states can come up with their own weird laws and even ignore national laws. These states are governed from their state capitals. Here in Oregon, the state capital is Salem, where politicians and lawmakers gather from around the state to decide on laws and regulations that will affect Oregonians on a statewide basis, and often in a god-awful looking building. However, to the federal government in DC, each state sends 2 senators and a certain number of representatives to the Congress. The number of representatives a state gets depends on its population, which means that Oregon gets 5 representatives. This also means that California, America's most populous state, gets 53 representatives, whereas Wyoming, America's least most populous state, only gets 1 for the whole state. Who gets represented by which representatives is decided on a geographical basis, with the state often being broken up into certain electoral districts, which is where gerrymandering can often come in, but that's a story for another time. On the government layer cake, states are among the same ranking as territories, DC itself, and even the various native reservations. These such entities are first-level divisions, meaning that they all report directly to the federal government itself, without any middlemen in between. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that they and their residents may have the same rights and privileges, just that their governments all interact with the national government in the same direct way. In terms of actual local administration, states are broken up into counties. Well, mostly. Louisiana divides itself into parishes, in touch with its French Catholic roots, and many states have cities independent of their surrounding cities that just kind of go on and do their own thing. Some examples of independent cities include Baltimore, Maryland, and Alexandria, Virginia. In addition, Alaska also divides itself up into boroughs of various levels of organization. However, for the most part, states break themselves up in the same way as the UK and Ireland do, which probably makes Brits and Irishmen feel somewhat small compared to America. Counties are responsible for local things that the state may not be able to fulfill for everyone in the state. Counties issue birth certificates to newborns born within their hospitals, register the kids to vote when they turn 18, lets them legally marry who they want, runs the police to catch them looting during the disaster that they're trying to handle, processes them in their courts and puts them in their jails, and eventually registers their death certificates once they expire, all the while collecting and paying the tax money for these services and keeping all the records of all these events straight. Counties are governed from a county seat. The county I live in is Multnomah County, whose county seat is Portland. All things considered, though, the county is basically just the cities of Portland and Gresham. Counties and parishes and boroughs, etc. are second-level divisions, as their governments and authorities rank below those of the states and territories, whose in turn rank below the federal authorities. In short, Oregon City governs Clackamas County but still reports to Salem, which governs all of Oregon but still reports to Washington, D.C. Got it? Probably not, but we're going deeper anyway. Below counties and the like, there are cities, towns, townships, barrios, chapters, and many other things. The best example of these are the cities themselves. While some cities may like to go off and do their own thing, most US cities generally stick to a county somewhere. In this way, Portland is merely a subdivision of Multnomah County, although cities obviously don't have capital cities, so they and their laws are generally governed from their respective city halls. Cities are in charge of many various utilities, such as local emergency forces and infrastructure projects. Of course, this isn't always required, as you often see empty fields occasionally filled with casinos that are simply part of the county itself, and are just unincorporated places not part of any town or city. Of course, there are also townships, which work similarly as subdivisions of counties, but are mainly used for land deeds and grants, and surveying the land back with this was more of a government priority. The fourth and final level are the city wards, not to be confused with hospital wards or my friend Sophie ward from the channel Soph's Notes. Though the role of a ward may differ between every country, in the US, wards are essentially subdivisions of cities and are themselves optional for cities to do, since by now the local representation is getting pretty local. As such, there isn't really much information on them, as there isn't really much of a use for them in the US. Wards are mainly used for electoral districts and local representation, but are also used as an administrative division in cities like Newark and Houston. Perhaps something more worth pointing out are public utility districts, which are divisions of cities that provide local services, like schools and emergency departments. I mean, it may be fine in a small town to just have one hospital, police and fire station and high school, etc., but if you live in Portland and live in, say, Mount Scott, you're not going to want to go to a school in Overlook, and you're certainly not waiting for the fire truck coming in from the station in Sumner. Now, public utility districts also provide electricity to power things like internet services, and also provide water and sewage treatment for all the crap that inevitably comes out of all the news headlines you read on Facebook. Now, I would go further, including explaining how other countries do this, but I felt that would be better as a story for another time. If you would actually like me to explain that in a future video, do let me know, and please as always be sure to like, share, and subscribe to learn something new every Sunday.